This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we're continuing our coverage of the crisis in Jerusalem, where 5 Israelis died Tuesday when a pair of Palestinians armed with meat cleavers and a gun stormed a synagogue during morning prayers. It was the deadliest attack on Israeli civilians in more than 3 years and the worst in Jerusalem since 2008.
We're joined now by two guests here in New York. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's the author of a number of books, including his latest, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. Aaron Efrati is also with us, a former Israeli combat soldier turned anti-occupation activist and investigative researcher. His family has lived in Jerusalem for 7 generations. Let's start with Professor Khalidi. Your response to what has taken place, not only yesterday, the killing of the 4 Israeli Jews and 1 Druze at the synagogue, but in the lead-up to that as well.
Well, tensions have been growing since the summer, and Jerusalem is the flashpoint when, on top of the pressure that Palestinians are all under because of this occupation that's now in its 5th decade, you have the issue of the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and you have calls by senior ministers in the Israeli government, like Naftali Bennett, to completely change the status quo, to, in effect, take over a Muslim holy place that's been the center of devotion for 1,400 years, and essentially do to it what was done to the mosque in Hebron, turn it into a Jewish holy place where Muslims are occasionally allowed. You are throwing fuel on the fire. And so ever since the last couple of months, there's just been an escalation in tension all over the city. You have increased settlement activity that just is penetrating neighborhood after neighborhood. Arab neighborhoods that have never seen armed settlers with a heavy military and police presence to guard them are now slowly but surely being colonized one by one. And so you're basically turning up the heat on a very, very hot situation, and that's been going on now for many months.
And given the inability of the leaders to be able to negotiate a settlement to the ongoing occupation, or do you think that there's a possibility that we're on the brink of a third intifada with the young people just saying, hey, our leaders can't deliver anything? Well,
I think that what Amir Haas earlier said is correct. In Jerusalem in particular, there's an absence of leadership, but there's an absence of leadership for the Palestinians as a whole. And that has been, I think, signaled over the Gaza crisis. It's been signaled over the inability of the Palestinians to actually put together a reconciliation, a unity government, and to define a strategy. I mean, Israel has a clear strategy. It is that they will negotiate forever, but they will not give up control of the occupied territories. The most important statement made by an Israeli politician was made by Netanyahu this summer. He said, we will keep permanent, perpetual security control of these territories. So he's basically said, no state, no sovereignty, no independence. You can talk as long as you want. I will meet with you, but you will never get an end to occupation. Well, that's something has to give here. I don't think, I agree with Amira, I think that people in the West Bank are afraid. They're both afraid of Israeli retaliation, and they're afraid of the security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority, which helps the Israelis to hold them down, and Israel. So I'm not sure that that's where we're going. We may be going to more, sadly, to more horrible random acts of violence and more eruptions of kids without leadership in various parts of the West Bank, perhaps, and Jerusalem.
Is there something shifting here from an Israeli-Palestinian conflict to Israeli, perhaps Jewish-Muslim conflict, which certainly involves many more people than just in that area?
Well, I mean, this is certainly grist for the mill of people who want to turn it into a religious conflict. There are certainly people on the Israeli side and people on the Palestinian side, but in the broader Arab and Muslim world. I mean, this group in Sinai, which announced its adherence to the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, is called Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. The Egyptian Sinai group that announced its adherence to the Islamic State, often Mosul and Baghdad, Baghdadi's group, is called Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, supporters of Jerusalem. This is a card that these people will play. So yes, this is not just Tinder in the Palestinian-Israeli arena, religious Tinder. This is religious Tinder all over the region. I don't know what, I'm not suggesting that's necessarily something is necessarily going to happen, but the Israeli government is playing with fire. They have a senior minister. Naftali Bennett is one of the 3 most important people in the Israeli cabinet. He is making incendiary statements. His party and Lieberman's party are saying and doing things that Palestinians watch. They know who these people are. They know how important they are in Israeli politics. They know the kind of support they have. And people are quite afraid, I think.
And Iran Efrati is a former soldier, now turned anti-occupation activist. Your reaction as you've seen this latest flare-up of this terrible attack yesterday?
Right. So I think when we're really trying to understand what happened in Jerusalem in the last few months, we need to understand in a broader context, the broader context of maybe 70 years of ethnic cleansing all over Palestine, but definitely in the last 40 years in East Jerusalem and around specifically the holy sites, trying to bring more and more Jews into this area instead of Palestinians and determine a new history, if you want. A new history when you cannot divide Jerusalem because Jews were always there in the old city and around these holy sites. So from this situation, the end goal is to make Palestinians leave Jerusalem. And we're trying to oppress them so much. And this is our goal. When I was in the army, in the police, in Jerusalem, the goal is to make people's life miserable. When we're in the army, they're trying to tell us that to do that, we're doing it for the fact that they will not act in terror attacks. So we need to make their life miserable so they will be afraid all the time and they will not have time to plan terror attacks. It's of course ridiculous. The end goal in the end that make them want to leave also made them want to do crazy things, like attacks on Jews and on Israelis. The second context I will talk about, I think it's important to talk about, is the last 10 years. Since the second Intifada, the end of the second Intifada, that was very bloody for both sides, the Palestinian society decided to act in non-violent acts, trying to go to the UN, like Amira Haas has mentioned, going to the UN, promoting BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement on Israel. All of that was countered in a very, very harsh oppression by Israel. People in Israel, officials in Israel, are calling them terrorists. If you're going to the UN, you're a political terrorist. If you're promoting BDS, you're an economic terrorist. People are arrested for that. Institute like the Molad Institute, a right-wing institute in Jerusalem, is calling the parliament, telling them that it will help them expose BDS activists to stop them and arrest them and destroying their homes. When
BDS being boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Right. I mean, when we're reacting to non-violent in such a violent way in oppression, and we explain to the Palestinians there is no legit way to resist the occupation. There is no legal way to resist us. It will always end up with violence. Oppression with violence will counter resistance with violence. And in the last 4 months, Jerusalem is burning. I'm from there. I'm a 7th generation in Jerusalem, and I was there in the last few months. Jerusalem is burning since the beginning of the summer, and of course since the killing of Muhammad Abu Khdeir, that, by the way, one of his killing that burned him to death in July was from Har Nof neighborhood. So the tension is always there, but the media was not always there, and the attention was not always there. For 40 years, East Jerusalem is in this situation, but nobody seemed to be noticing, because in the last 10 years, for Israelis, since the end of the Second Intifada, it was quiet years. For us, it was peaceful years, because we weren't living in fear. But Palestinians never had those quiet years. They always lived in fear. They didn't stop being attacked by the police, by the army, and now, since this summer, by civilians, by mobs on the streets, going there and looking to lynch people. And they do, like Muhammad Abu Khdeir, like 2 days ago, when they found in East Jerusalem a bus driver, a Palestinian bus driver, a father to 2 little girls, hung in the middle of his bus after a violent attack on him, lynching him and hanging him up in the middle of the bus. But it doesn't seem like nobody's talking about it.
Wait, explain that, because it was said that he committed suicide.
Yes, the police came out, exactly like in the Muhammad Abu Khdeir story, by the way, when they came out and say that his family found out that their son is gay, and this is why they kill him. Some homophobic and racism combined together, and of course, in the end, they have to admit that he was actually lynched to death. The same here, the police came out immediately and said that he committed suicide. His picture, by the way, is going around online, and you can see the violent signs on his body and the rope around his neck. It's completely crazy, but nobody's talking about it. I'm hearing Barack Obama coming out and condemning this story. I think it's important to understand that it's important to condemn violence against civilians. But where was he when violence against Palestinian civilians are happening every day?
I wanted to ask you about the role of Americans here financing and helping to support settlement expansion in Israel, the impact that has.
Definitely. So much money is being transferred mostly from the evangelicals, but not only. Weapon companies that fuel this government, lobbyists of weapon companies that fuel this government, and a lot of right-wing Zionist movements in this country is actually being fueled to the settlement movement in East Jerusalem, all over the West Bank, and to the right-wing parties in Israel. In a lot of ways, the U.S. controls completely the political situation in Israel. Like Professor Khalidi just mentioned, the political atmosphere is extremely violent and fascist. And the United States not only enabled that, it's backing it up with money and with support.
I want to turn to comments President Obama made following the attacks on the synagogue yesterday.
Tragically, this is not the first loss of life that we have seen in recent months. Too many Israelis have died, too many Palestinians have died. And at this difficult time, I think it's important for both Palestinians and Israelis to try to work together to lower tensions and to reject violence. The murders for today's outrageous acts represent the kind of extremism that threatens to bring all of the Middle East into the kind of spiral from which it's very difficult to emerge, and we know how this violence can get worse over time. But we have to remind ourselves that the majority of Palestinians and Israelis overwhelmingly want peace and to be able to raise their families knowing they're safe and secure. The United States wants to work with all parties involved to make that a reality and to isolate the kinds of extremists that are bringing about this terrible carnage.
That's President Obama speaking yesterday in response to the attacks on the Jerusalem synagogue. Professor Khalidi, your response and how you feel the U.S. Should respond.
Well, the United States is precisely the enabler of all of this. The United States, by its diplomatic support, prevents any real pressure on Israel to stop it from occupation, settlement, and repression.
And the tension reportedly between Netanyahu and Obama?
I mean, that and 5 cents won't get you a cup of coffee. The president can vent and have his acolytes and his flacks and his hacks say nasty things about the Israeli prime minister. As long as American money is going to support the repression of Palestinians, as long as 501c3 supposedly charitable organizations in this country are not stopped by the Justice Department, are not stopped by the Treasury from funneling tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to settlement activities and to the repression of Palestinians, what the president says is meaningless. This is an American Israeli enterprise, in fact. The money is largely from the United States. The weapons are from the United States. We are implicated, and we are running interference for Israel. Whenever anybody tries to do anything, the British Parliament, the Spanish Parliament, the Irish Parliament, the Swedish government, the United States objects. Whenever anybody tries to do anything diplomatically or in a nonviolent manner, such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we're told that these are anti-Semitic actions. So presumably the Palestinians are supposed to lie down and let the bulldozers and the settlement enterprise and the repression run over them and go back to negotiations, which Netanyahu has already told us can never lead to an end of occupation. That's the doing of the United States to a very large extent, I'm afraid.
Your family background, Professor Khalidi, I mentioned that Aaron's family goes back, what, 7 generations in Jerusalem. Yours?
Our family, my family is a Jerusalem family. My uncle was the last elected Arab mayor of Jerusalem. He was elected in 1934. He was deported to the Seychelles by the British in 1937, but he served as mayor for 3 years before British colonialism dealt with him. So we're an old Jerusalem family. I have cousins living there, and I've talked to them. It's scary. What Amira reported is true. There is an enormous amount of fear. People who have families, people who have kids, are really worried about what will happen to their kids. They're worried about what will happen. You know, my cousin has a garden. Israeli undercover agents leap over the wall and chase people through their garden. It's terrifying, and there's nothing you can do about it. Palestinians have no share in the governance of this city. It is ruled by others, for a project that is designed to dispossess them and make them into third-class citizens, and ultimately, if possible, get as many of them out. They're 38% of the population of Jerusalem, Palestinian Arabs, and yet they are treated as if they have absolutely no rights.
And given the worldwide condemnation of the occupation and the continuing refusal of the Israeli government to negotiate some kind of just settlement, what do you see in terms of potential hope for any kind of progress in the conflict?
Well, one thing that is happening is that in this country, there is an awakening in younger people, the kind of people who watch this show or listen to this show, people who do not consume the mainstream media, people on campuses. There's an enormous change in public opinion below the level of the mainstream media. The second thing is in Europe, there is an enormous shift. 4 major European countries have had parliaments or governments actually take a stand. Now, that has yet to be translated into effective pressure to stop these acts of oppression.
Sweden
but we're
just
getting
recognized Palestine.
Sweden has recognized Palestine. The Spanish parliament voted yesterday. The Irish parliament has voted, and the British parliament has voted. So we have 4 of the most important countries in the world have come around or beginning to come around in an official fashion on this. This is only going to increase. Everybody in Europe knows what's going on. What the American media doesn't tell the Americans, the European media does tell Europeans. And so I think that you're going to see increasing pressure on Israel, at least from Europe and the rest of the world. The problem is here. The problem is in this country.
Finally, Netanyahu saying that the occupation will remain forever because the borders are indefensible. Your response?
Well, he claimed that what has happened with the erection of this supposed Islamic caliphate shows why Israel has to maintain permanent security control over the Jordan River Valley and the entirety of the occupied territories. I mean, he's been finding excuses for the longest time why Israel has to continue settling, has to continue occupying, has to continue oppressing. It's a pretty transparent maneuver. Obviously, you do not control a region by oppressing the people and turning them into your enemies, which is what Israel has been doing for 47 years.
We're going to have to leave it there. We thank you both very much for being with us. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, author of a number of books, including, most recently, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, and Aaron Efrati, former Israeli combat soldier turned anti-occupation activist and investigative researcher. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a very close vote in the Senate to defeat the Keystone XL pipeline. Stay with us.